I'm Amy Thompson, A-M-Y-T-H-O-M-P-S-O-N. I'm with Encore Stage and Studio in Arlington, Virginia, and also Nottingham Elementary School in Arlington, Virginia, and the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so would you please, what advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students? And what's one thing that you've done that's worked well in the past?
If teachers want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students, my advice is start as soon as possible. Children, even in elementary school, start to develop a self-image that they need to maintain at all times. By the time they get to 4th, 5th grade, they're not quite as open. So 3rd grade or before is probably best. Children that age are very open. They're not afraid. They're not afraid to say they don't understand. They're not afraid to try new things. And I think the earlier you start, the better. One thing that I have done that has helped me in the past is to just get them up on their feet and putting the words in their mouth as soon as possible. Start the very first day using Shakespeare's words.
Can you repeat the question?
No, that's okay. For teachers wanting to do Shakespeare with their younger students, the advice that I would give to them is to just free themselves from the idea that they need to slavishly teach the whole play and that every single word that Shakespeare wrote is sacred. Just allow them to cut the text and to choose scenes and speeches that are full of action and full of great images that the kids will really get into and not feel that they have to go word by word through absolutely everything. And then in looking at that text, the more that they can do that's active and on their feet with the kids, actually speaking the text and acting it out is going to be the best, because they're plays, they're not novels, and they're meant to be heard and spoken. So anything that gets the kids up on their feet with the language in their mouths and acting out the stories and putting themselves in the character's shoes and getting at the text from the inside rather than the outside in is going to be great. A great introductory activity that I do with students when we're first starting a play, before they know anything about the play, is a game where we just stand in a circle and each student has a word, just a single word from the text, and we pass a ball around as they say their word from the text in different order. And then they're starting to hear different words that recur and different themes start to emerge about what the story might be about based on those words. And it activates their predicting skills, and it's their little hook into wanting to know more about what this story is going to be about.
I'm Barbara Cobb, B-A-R-B-A-R-A-C-O-B-B. I'm an associate professor of English at Murray State University.
What advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students, and what's one thing that you've done in the past that worked well?
My advice for teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to young students is to collaborate. Start early. Find a college professor, a theater person, community theater person, a high school teacher, middle school teacher, elementary school teacher, where 2 or 3 teachers are together. Then you're going to have some magic happening with Shakespeare. One thing that's worked for us, we've started with 3rd graders. And we've started with the play The Tempest. There are numerous storybook versions, picture book versions of The Tempest. And we introduce that play to these 3rd graders. They love the plot. And then we give them scripts in Shakespeare's English, and they handle it really beautifully. We do a mini festival where the students do scenes. We have interludes in between the scenes, and they present them for a group of their peers and the parents, and they just love it. When they go on to 4th grade, we introduce them to sonnets. In 6th grade, it's either As You Like It or Twelfth Night. This year, we're going to introduce them in 7th grade to Midsummer Night's Dream. By the time they get to high school, we think that their high school teachers are going to be absolutely in love with the fact that these students are already prepared, they're already engaged. One high school teacher once asked me, how do I get students engaged with Shakespeare? And I said, start early. If they're already engaged before you get them, your job's easy.
One of the things I'd like elementary teachers to know is that they needn't be afraid to try Shakespeare because of all the wonderful toys and books and models of the globe and resources at the Folger and other places for teachers online and in stores. And I think they'll find that their students take to Shakespeare, especially if it's presented in a playful way. They learn by playing, and Shakespeare wrote plays, and that's what he was all about. One of the things that I use to help young students understand the very complicated plot of A Midsummer Night's Dream is to use finger puppets on a magnetic board so that I can move the characters around and explain the main plot and the 3 subplots within.
And spell your name, please.
Okay, my name is Edward Durany, Edward Darany, and I'm the resident teaching artist for the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in Stratford, Ontario, Canada.
Okay.
So here's the question. What advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to young students? And what's one thing that you've done that's worked well for you?
My best advice on introducing Shakespeare to young students is to jump right in, to start it early. The younger you start it, the less fear children have with language and imagery. And kids that are young have little fear anyways, and they understand the visceral part of the language, even if they don't understand all of the words. But it's all about teaching opportunities and learning opportunities. So the younger you start, the better. What's worked for me in the past is I do this thing called the 60-second Shakespeare, where I tableau the 10 best moments of the play from start to finish. And I have groups work on 1 or 2 of the tableaus for a few minutes, and then they present to one another. And then they present the whole play, and when we put it together, we set it to music. So the entire thing lasts about 1.5 minutes and is a kind of a living tableau, a tableau vivant.
Terrific. Perfect.
Call me your name and spell it, please.
Harvey Sadis, Harveysadis. I'm a retired teacher from Seattle, Washington.
Perfect.
Okay. So here's the question. What advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students and identify one thing that's worked well for them in the past?
All children love great stories, and they especially love to hear those stories over and over again. Children at the age that I have been teaching are natural sponges. They have no filters. Whatever they hear and see, they retain. Children also love highly charged words, words like hatred or villain or churl. What I learned is that girls especially love to play traditional boys' parts in Shakespeare. One of the questions they are always asking is, do I get to wear a sword, and who do I get to kill? Children are drawn especially to fairy tales, and they are not particularly insistent that the fairy tales have happy endings, the way we often see in Disney. They demand that their fairy tales be honest. And that's why children are especially drawn to Shakespeare, because they can see in these stories an honesty that they can really relate to. Much of what goes on outside the view of teachers out on the playground are particularly apt material for children as they approach Shakespeare. For instance, when I've done Macbeth in the past, all the sizing up that goes on the playground with ambitious children who are trying to form relationships, they're often asking, each other, are you my friend? If you're my friend, you'll do this for me. Teachers must believe that children can enter Shakespeare's world with deep understanding. Children have incredible attention spans. We often don't give them credit for that, but I've found that when children see that I'm passionate about Shakespeare, they readily provide their own passions for it. Children are particularly interested in great words, and they're also interested in rhyme and repetition. One of the things that I've seen that has served me well when I was doing Shakespeare is to get children out of their seats as quickly as possible with script in hand and actually to move. Children are able to pair their movements with the spoken word and actually provide their lines with much more conviction because they have a motivation to move across the room with a particular line in mind.
Holly Rogers, HOLLYRODGERS, Fairfax County Public Schools in Fairfax County, Virginia.
What advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students, and what's one thing that's worked well for you in the past?
Well, for elementary school teachers that are interested in doing Shakespeare with their students, I would advise them to make Shakespeare a comfortable figure with their students in their classroom. Shakespeare is not someone that should be intimidating. I think if students have an initial positive experience with Shakespeare and feel that he's, something as familiar to them as Mother Goose nursery rhymes, they're not going to feel scared of him when they encounter Shakespeare later in life. What's worked for me with my students has been starting with story and characters first and then working into Shakespeare's language. I think Shakespeare's plays have endured so long because the stories are so engaging and they're relatable to all people, all cultures, all ages, and that's what hooks students in initially. And I think if you cover the ground of the story with them, they're going to be interested enough that they're going to want to work through that difficult vocabulary and language. And students, I work with English as a second language learner, or ESL students or ELLs, and my students have been able to do Shakespeare, students as young as 3rd grade all the way up through 6th grade. So it's absolutely possible to do Shakespeare with all students, all cultures, all English proficiency levels, and all learners.
My name is Lucy Tyson, L-U-C-Y-T-Y-S-O-N. I'm the Director of Education at the Philadelphia Shakespeare Theater.
What advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students, and what's one thing that's worked well for you in the past?
One bit of advice that I would give to teachers who are considering introducing Shakespeare to younger students is to remember that their job and their primary goal is really to whet the appetite of their students, to give them an opportunity to meet Shakespeare in a way that's engaging, that will then translate to a greater interest the next time those students meet Shakespeare, whether that be in 8th grade for Midsummer Night's Dream or in 9th grade for Romeo and Juliet. But to remember that they are starting their students on a journey, on a long-term relationship with Shakespeare. And so they don't have to worry about teaching every single word of the play. They don't have to worry about getting into the really complicated kind of literary ideas. The job is to kind of whet that appetite. And so one of the things that I think works well, that I found to work well, is to introduce the play in a way that is going to catch their interest. And so I found that before introducing the language, a good pre-reading exercise is to focus on character and story. A good story is irresistible to anyone, no matter what age you are. And Shakespeare writes good stories. And so one of the things that I've done is to use tableaus in the classroom, and what I'll do is I'll break students up into groups, and they'll have a card, and on that card there'll be a scenario from the play. Now before this, I may have gone over just an outline of the story of the play so that they have an overall idea of how the story goes. And so on their cards, they have a scenario from the play, and they have the different characters represented, and they have to create a tableau, which is kind of a frozen picture with people. And so they have some dynamic moment from a scene in the play, whether that be from Taming of the Shrew. You have the kind of patriarchal father figure with Petruchio standing between his two daughters, Kate looking shrewish and frustrated, and Bianca looking spoiled and perfect. And so they create that dynamic moment, and we take a picture of it. And so you can go as far as you want with this activity. You can start with just printing the pictures, and they can mount them on cardboard and decorate them. And then a way to introduce the language is to give them all a line that corresponds to that key moment. And they create that caption for each picture with the line from the play. And you can hang those pictures around the classroom as kind of a photo album of the play, of key moments in the play. Or if you wanted to go really far with it and you have more technology, you could turn it into a slideshow. You could have voiceovers with students reading the different lines from the play in as great an inflection in their voices as they can muster. And you could have multiple scenes. Your photo album can really be as small or as large as you want it to be. But again, just kind of focusing on getting them interested in the story, in the characters, and getting them hearing some of those key lines and those the language from the play, so as to make them comfortable with it, but also really interested and eager to know more.
Rebecca Nazario Wright, REBECCA NAZARIO WRIGHT, and I am a demonstration teacher at Falk Laboratory School.
And is that F-A-U-L-K?
F-A-L-K.
F-A-L-K.
Yep.
And where is
that? Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We're part of University of Pittsburgh.
Okay, perfect. And you'll just be talking right to the camera.
Okay, so the question is, what advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students? And what's one thing that you've done that's worked well for you?
I think the best advice I could give to teachers that are thinking about working with Shakespeare with their young students would be, just do it. Jump in, do it. Expose the children to Shakespeare, to his life, to his times, so the children feel kind of enmeshed and enveloped in that whole time period. When I did that, it made The Tempest much more accessible to the kids, just having an understanding of what was going on at that time in history in England. One thing that I did, one approach that I took that I thought was really helpful with my students, they were second graders, it was the end of the year, was I took an emergent curriculum approach. I exposed them to things. We read storybooks that were drawn from Shakespeare's plays, and then I let them run with the ball and let them direct the unit, the study, the things we were going to do. And I think that when you put the children in the driver's seat when it comes to something as potentially intimidating as Shakespeare, it makes it such a much more rich and positive experience for everybody. I think I learned more than they did. It was a blast. It really was a blast.
Great.
Perfect.
Advice that I would give to a teacher who has young students in terms of giving them a great introduction to Shakespeare is not to be concerned with teaching a whole play or a long passage or a long scene, but to give them a section of any of that they think would be dramatic and fun and crazy and wild and interesting and compelling, and so hook the students on what's going on that they want more of it. An example of that was that I do teach older students, and I have one of my students has a mother who teaches 5th grade. So we took a group of my students down to visit that 5th grade classroom. And while we were there, we did all kinds of warm-up games and some insult hurling and had a great time. But my favorite part of all was when we did a collaborative scene, which was the storm scene from The Tempest. We cut it down a bit, and my students had prepared lines ahead of time, and we incorporated the younger students with them. They became the ship, they became the sea, they became the lightning and the thunder and the waves and Ariel, the spirit. And what happened was, together, we put on a very quick scene with high drama and high spirits and a lot of fun. And had I had more time to work with those students, I would have introduced even more of the language for the younger students to be involved in that as well. But it was a beginning, it was an opening, and it was a good connection on a whole bunch of different levels with the language between the older students and the younger students and the younger students and the older students and me with another teacher. And I think it began the start of something that should be fruitful for everyone.
The advice I would give to a teacher working with Shakespeare and young students is once they have their lines memorized, to get them to move. I found that most often, once they've memorized them, they either give the deliberate robot delivery, or they jumble us through as fast as they can so they don't forget anything. So if you can get them to move, to do something completely unrelated to the text, while they say it, they loosen up and become human beings and characters again. For example, Thisbe giving CPR to Pyramus while she says her lines. Or in the dialogue between Titania and Bottom, having Titania push him back and forth across the stage so that he falls down rather rapidly, and while he tries to back away from her. Again, loosens it up and gives them a feeling for the relationship or the non-relationship in that case.
Waduda Henderson, WADUDAHenderson. I'm a Montessori teacher, and I teach grades 1 through 5 combined in DC public schools.
What advice would you give to teachers who want to introduce Shakespeare to their young students? And what's one thing that you've done in the past that's worked well?
First thing I'd say is don't be afraid. Just swing out there and take a risk. Because it's not just about a 20-minute performance in a festival. It's not only about you as the teacher. It's all about the children finding out who they are. And out of that, you end up building a class community. So I'd say don't be afraid, take the risks, and don't have any preconceived ideas of expectations of the children or anything else. Just go with the flow. After that, everything becomes something that you build as a group. And so I find that the most amazing part. You start out with one idea, but it evolves, and you need to be prepared to let it become organic. One thing I've done is I ask my children to try to get whatever we're doing down to 25 words or less, because that's very hard. It's very hard to say something in 25 words or less using one-syllable words. And to start with the whole and break it down to the finer points. For example, once we choose a play, for example, if we decide we want to do The Tempest or Macbeth, we look at all of Shakespeare's works first, and we find out what are the basic plots. Girl meets boy. If it's a tragedy, they die. If it's a comedy, they get together, it's a happy ending. So helping the child get to the heart of the matter and finding out, what's the skeleton of this and what we put on it using Shakespeare's words, using our imaginations, costumes, whatever we do, gives us the shape of what we're doing. It helps us tap into the imaginations of our fellow students, of the audience, and create this great piece that has us, along with Shakespeare, doing it together.